Now I bet when you think of the Appalachian Mountains, you picture small, woodsy cabins or old ramshackle houses barely fit for habitation. I get it. I live here, and people are always surprised to find out that not all the Appalachian towns are like that. There are some really nice places in my neck of the woods. I grew up in a big 2-story house filled with all the modern amenities that you had, or at least most of them. I also attended college in Massachusetts, so unlike a lot of my generation, I got out of the mountains. And you might think that made me happy, freed me in some way, but you'd be wrong. I missed my home, my family, and my mountains. Though I had a defined goal, I was lost. After graduation, I was desperate to return home, even if it was only for a short time. Nothing had changed much, except for me, perhaps, and after 3 months at home, I figured that out. I had mountains of my own making, student debt, unfortunately. I had to go back north to find a job so I could pay that debt, and eventually I made a life in New York. That life did not include a wife or kids. Nah, I was too busy for that, and if I'm being perfectly honest, I didn't want anything else to tie me to New York than my job. I lived on a bare-bones budget, rented a shitty little apartment, and owned a Saab that was nice around 1980. It wasn't like I'd ever drove it, but it was nice to have on those occasions when I wanted to get away from the city. And it was nice that I had a car when I got an unexpected letter in the mail a few months ago. The return address was the law office of Mitchell Morales in Jonesboro, Tennessee. My hometown was about a 45-minute drive from there, but I had no idea why I was getting anything from a lawyer. After reading the communication, I was in disbelief. The letter said that I inherited the property of Mabel and Jarvis Bellamy. They were listed as my great-aunt and uncle. I only had one great-aunt. She was in her mid-70s, but she was definitely still alive and doing just fine living on her own 2 houses down the road from my parents. My mother got quiet when I called to ask her about Mabel and Jarvis. I thought she had hung up on me, or that the call dropped. Then, in a quiet voice, she told me that I had better come home. The drive down was long, and I was keyed up after learning that my boring, average Joe family had a secret that was big enough to necessitate me taking time off of work and driving hundreds of miles to get an explanation for. Needless to say, I didn't stop for a hotel room. Instead, I drove for 12.5 hours, stopping along the way to stretch my legs every now and then. My parents didn't want me to accept the inherited property, but I just couldn't let it go. I demanded to know about the aunt and uncle that I had never met, but who obviously knew about me. Mabel had disappeared when I was only 3. Apparently, she had been to our house and vice versa before that. After her mysterious disappearance, though, Jarvis changed. By the time I was 4, the family no longer went to visit him, and he never visited any of them. Mom said that's the way he wanted things. Now, Dad leveled with me later, away from Mom. Jarvis was her uncle, and she didn't want to talk about what had happened all those years ago. Dad thought I had a right to know in light of the inheritance. A few months after Mabel disappeared, the family and the cops began to think Jarvis had something to do with it. They thought he might have killed her and hid her remains on the property, maybe even in the house. Dad said he thought that part was a load of bullshit, though. Jarvis was a curmudgeon, didn't get on well with most people, and he liked his solitude, hence the property in the hollow, deep in the mountain. He was just a lonely old man after Mabel disappeared, son. He was a bastard to get along with sometimes, but I think he was harmless under all that gruff exterior. Dad clapped me on the shoulder and smiled. Oh, besides, don't let the stories cheat you out of what's rightfully yours. Mabel and Jarvis weren't exactly poor, you know. No, I don't know, Dad. I never knew them, remember? The letter had mentioned a considerable sum of money that would be mine, but Mr. Morales had suspiciously left out the exact amount. Well, they're both gone, and all that land and that house. Wow, that house? That's yours, son. What kind of house? Why did you say wow? He laughed and shook his head. Oh, it's a huge Victorian mansion right in the middle of nowhere. Mabel's family left it to her. It was built sometime in the mid-1800s and stayed in her family all that time. Well, till now, I guess. There were priceless antiques in that house back in the day. Some of the furniture came from England or Germany or somewhere like that. But the point is, it's all yours now. He stepped in front of me to block my view out the window. Don't screw up, and you're set for life, Tony. Well, where is this place? He gave me directions, and I left the next day without telling anyone. I didn't want Mom try to talk me out of it, and I wanted a clear mind when I saw the place. It was my future, after all. Now, if this road had ever been well maintained, it was not any longer. I had to straddle washouts and deep ruts with my car, and for a half an hour, I sweated bullets and white-knuckled the steering wheel as the speedometer set right around 10. Then the road narrowed, but it was in better shape. A few times, tree limbs squealed down the passenger side of the car, making me cringe. After another 10 minutes, I came to an obstacle I couldn't get around. A maple tree, right in the middle of the road. The house was about 500 feet beyond that point. My father was right to say wow about it too, because it was massive. I parked and got out, kind of relishing the cool breeze and the smell of the pines. The air was clean even if it was damp. It was so different from the city air, filled with exhaust fumes and the low underlining stench of rotting trash, that I stood there for a few minutes, just inhaling and staring toward the house. It was nestled in a glen where time seemed to have stopped in the 1800s. I just remember thinking, was it true? Could it really be mine? Could it mean a fresh start? Or was I getting my hopes up just to have them dashed? As I walked around the maple tree and into knee-high yellowing grass, the view opened up and I could see the house better. Its once vibrant blue and green paint had faded. Its once grand facade hid behind thick ropes of ivy that had taken one entire wall. The spires and intricate woodwork were barely visible through the dense foliage. I'd only thought I was seeing the whole house before, and as I moved closer, I realized that the mansion was larger than it seemed at first. The elms, hickories, and maples cloaked much of the structure in swaying shadows. A rope swing dangled from the lowest limb on a half-dead beech tree, and underneath it, a yellow toy dump truck lay on its side, partially covered with moss. One of its wheels was missing, and I wondered who had played with it. Mabel and Jarvis had no kids. Passing the abandoned toy, the breeze picked up and the temperature dropped. It was enough of a drop that I took note and wondered if I should have brought a flannel shirt or a jacket. I stopped and I looked up at the empty black windows, and they stared down at me like the soulless eyes of a ghost. A sense of unease settled over me, and I chided myself for the thought. They were just windows. There was nothing nefarious or sinister in that house, and the house itself wasn't malicious. Kind of funny how those thoughts wouldn't leave me as I walked, though, and I couldn't keep from glancing quickly at each window as I moved slowly toward the front porch. The front doors stood open. At first I thought my eyes were playing a trick on me because of the deep shadows on the porch, but as I mounted the steps, I could see the door was really open a couple of inches, and that gave me pause and almost caused me to leave. I could return with someone in a day or two, but then I looked around. Who would be back there? Maybe some curious teenagers, but probably not. It was more likely that a curious black bear would be in there than a person. I pushed the door, and the hinges creaked loudly in the silence. I announced myself to anyone who might be in there, but there was no sound in the cavernous interior. No creak of floorboards, no shuffling of feet, no snorts or growls, just silence. Chill ran over me when I crossed the threshold, though. I don't know exactly what I was expecting after seeing how the exterior had been neglected, but it definitely wasn't what I saw. In the grand entry hall, faded peeling wallpaper that was easily over 100 years old fluttered as the breeze found its way inside through the wide open door. Antique furniture that had been placed with care to showcase its beauty now sat covered in cobwebs, nature's dust covers. A grandmother clock sat silently in the curve under the grand staircase, which had undoubtedly been the centerpiece of the home, but looked labored and tired under the weight of years of neglect. And I could almost see the ghostly figures of Jarvis and Mabel sitting on the furniture, walking the stairs, and forever trapped in time before Mabel disappeared. A time when they were, well, I wanted to say happy, but that wasn't the prevalent feeling. Mabel was sad. Jarvis was worried, nervous even. Maybe my mind inserted those feelings because of the story my dad had told me. I mean, it wasn't like I could really see them. I didn't even know what they looked like, so how could the man and woman I saw in my mind be them? Now, to the left of the main entrance was a cavernous dark room filled with more antique furniture that had been properly draped with white sheets. The massive fireplace was made of stone. The hearth held the cold, ashy remains of the last fire that had warmed the room. I wondered how long ago that had been. Above the mantel there were 2 large portraits. One of them, a man who looked to be in his 40s. The other was of a woman of similar age with beautiful eyes. Her delicate features made her even more attractive. The man, however, was not good-looking. Back in the day, sure, he might have been considered handsome, but even then I had my doubts. Lucky bastard. She could have had any man she wanted, I told him. I hoped it wasn't true that he had done something to Mabel. The air was thick with the smell of decay and mildew, and I wondered if anything would be salvageable. Maybe Jarvis had lived there alone, and been unable to properly care for the place for several years. The rustle of an unseen, small creatures caused me to hurry out of the dark room and into the library. A large walnut desk sat in the center of the expansive room. The moth-eaten drapes allowed random shafts of light to penetrate the heavy gloom, and the towering bookshelves, packed with ancient dusty books, formed the labyrinth of dark rows cast into darkness that exuded a feeling of dread that I could not ignore. Felt like somebody was watching me, and I looked back through the living room and stopped in the entrance hall to calm my nerves. Now, I found an old push-button light switch, but thought for sure that it wouldn't work. I mean, hadn't those things been out of use since the 1940s? And as a way to get my mind off the looming dread that lurked in the library, I pushed the button, and I was stunned when an overhead bulb flickered to life. It was yellow and did little help to illuminate the area, but it was nice to know there were working lights in the old place. I could have gone back into the living room and library to see if they had lights, but I was over those rooms. I'd seen all I cared to see in the dimness. I moved down the hallway, poked my head into the sitting room, or parlor, or whatever they're called, but I didn't go in. It was more of the same: antique furniture, cobwebs, cold ashes, and neglect. I didn't like the sadness, and I moved quickly to the next room. The dining room was a narrow, long space dominated by a mahogany table. The drapes had been opened, and soft light filtered through the ivy that covered the outside of the windows, dappling the scarred surface of the table. An ornate, tarnished brass candelabra sat in the center of the table. The 10 high-backed chairs sat majestically, awaiting guests that would never sit in them. So why did Mabel and Jarvis own such a monstrosity of a dinner table if it was only the two of them? Was it just part and parcel of her inheritance? Artifacts from her family's past that she couldn't bear to part with? Well, it's yours now. An internal voice that I didn't recognize reminded me. Something touched my back and just between my shoulder blades, and I spun. The room was empty except for the dancing shadows cast by the ivy as it shuddered in the breeze. Swallowing over the huge lump in my throat, I took a deep breath and I stepped into the hallway again. At the end of the corridor, the kitchen stood open. Longer, more sinister-looking shadows swayed slowly against the floor, the walls, and a long waist-high table that was visible. I could see a few copper pots hanging from hooks over the table and the cracked, uneven brick floor, but that was good enough for me. Turning on my heel, I headed for the staircase. The upper floors would have better light from outside. Wouldn't matter if the light switches worked. More light equaled fewer frightening thoughts. A grand 4-poster bed with a tattered, sagging pearl-white canopy dominated the space. When a bedroom was meant to be a peaceful sanctuary. And again, that odd, unfamiliar internal voice said, what the hell did that even mean, when a bedroom was meant to be a peaceful sanctuary? I shook my head and walked toward the dust-covered nightstand where a small music box sat. The picture on the satin cover was so worn that it was impossible to tell what it had been. A haunting melody tinkled when I pushed open the lid. A soft sigh from the opposite corner caused me to turn so fast that I dropped the box. Now, you might think I was just being a coward or that I had scared myself with the imaginative meanderings, but you'd be wrong. You see, I know what I heard. One time, my aunt had gone missing, my dad's only sibling. I was young and me and Mom stayed with Grandma while the search teams went out. And Grandma thought for sure that her only daughter had been murdered by an abusive ex-husband. When Dad and the cops brought Sheila home, my grandmother's first reaction was to put her hand over her mouth and to sigh with relief. And that's what I heard in that long, forgotten bedroom, but there was no one there when I turned. Just an old wardrobe with a wonky door. "Hello?" I called. Maybe it was someone in another room. It only sounded like it was in that room. "Hello? If there's someone here, you're not in trouble. I mean you no harm. You can come out." I talked as I moved out of the room and slowly down the hall toward more bedrooms. The fourth room was a nursery, and I wondered why had Mabel kept a nursery. If she couldn't have kids, wouldn't that be a form of emotional torture? But dust coated every surface of it. Plaster had cracked and fallen from the ceilings in a few places, and the faded name, Brady, was barely visible above the old crib. Now intrigued, I walked to the crib. An oval dark stain in the middle of the little mattress gave me a chill. It was a size and shape of... Nah, I said aloud. The ceiling had to have a leak or something. I looked up and instantly knew better. I couldn't start thinking about what it might have really been. In the next bedroom, the bed frame held down a mattress and pillows. It was oddly devoid of dust and cobwebs. The impression of the last person to lay there was still visible, and somehow that was as chilling as the dark stain had been in the nursery. I backed towards the door. I wondered if someone was there. I had nothing for protection, and I wondered how long it would take anyone to figure out where I'd gone before they'd start even looking for me. Now, hurrying back down the stairs, quietly as possible, I listened for the sound of feet rushing toward me, or the sounds of doors creaking. At the foot of the stairs, I stopped and glanced into the living room. The darkness was thicker, and a feeling of foreboding kept me from dashing out of the door immediately. It was the feeling that as soon as I stepped off those stairs, someone or something was going to rush me from the darkness in there. "I'm not lucky," a man whispered in a gruff voice. My heart nearly exploded in my chest. My hand tightened around the top of the newel post, and I shot down the hallway toward the kitchen. Why? I don't know. My body reacted before I had time for thought. I stopped just shy of the kitchen and I looked back. Laughter wafted out of the living room, and it didn't sound quite there. Now I can't explain it better than that. It was thin, as if being transmitted over a great distance. "Who's there?" I croaked, trying to be brave. Maybe it was teenagers after all. Maybe they were getting their laughs by scaring the hell out of me. From behind me in the shadowed depths of the kitchen, the same man's voice said, "She was crazy." I turned so fast, I almost fell. But I saw no one. "You can't be real. You have to be imagining this," I whispered to myself to calm my nerves. Ethereal hands hit me in the chest, knocking me back 3 steps, and a woman's scream filled the silence. Clamping my hands over my ears, I bolted toward the open door, and as I passed the staircase, I felt claws tearing at my back between my shoulders. My legs felt like lead as I pushed them harder, and that damn door shut so fast that dust woofed up in its wake. But it was too late for me to stop. I slammed into it, and the claws slid down my back again. The knob turned, but the door wouldn't open. The claws tore into the tender flesh over my right kidney, and I turned. Fight or flight had kicked in, and flight was no longer an option. The snarling, frizzy-haired woman was transparent as she flew toward me. Her feet weren't touching the floor. I swung wildly as I screamed, and her scream drowned out my own. She curled her left hand into a claw. I couldn't touch her, so how could she touch me? The hand descended toward my face, and I shrank back towards the door with my arm raised to protect my face. "Mabel Ann Blackwood, you stop it now," the man's voice bellowed. I squeezed my hand shut and felt around until I had the doorknob in my hand again. I turned it and pulled it until I was sure I would break the whole thing, but nothing happened. "Tricked me," the woman shrieked. "Not Brady," she wailed. Her anger subsided into heart-wrenching sobs. "No tricks," the man said in a soothing tone. I risked a glance and I saw Mabel with her withered hands over her face as she flitted from one piece of furniture to the next, crying loudly. The man's back was to me, but he turned, and I saw the same man who was in the portrait over the fireplace mantel. He had a permanent scowl. His eyes widened as he moved close to my face. "Take the money and don't come back." He glanced over his transparent shoulder at her, moving more frantically. "Or she'll kill you." He reached into the door, and something clicked. The door drifted open a couple of inches, and he turned back to Mabel. Now, I didn't have to be told twice. I was out the door and off that mountain in record time. I didn't go to my parents' house. I went to the hospital and I got stitched and bandaged first. I gave them a story about hiking and falling down an embankment up on the trail. I didn't think they believed me, but they didn't call me out either. Now that night, I asked my dad to tell me what Mabel and Jarvis were really like. He was reluctant, but he finally told me that Mabel had a baby years before I was born. They suspect she had postpartum depression, which wasn't really known back then, and she killed her baby boy. His name was Brady. And when I came along, she had been ecstatic that there was another baby boy in the family. As I got older, she tried to take me from Mom one evening, said she would put me to bed so that they could have supper in peace. I was being fussy or crying, and it agitated her. Mom insisted on holding me, and Mabel became enraged. She screamed and clawed my face while my mother held me. Dad said it terrified me more than it hurt me, and Mom slapped Mabel hard. Jarvis grabbed Mabel and dragged her out of the door. The next time they heard from him was when he called to say that she had gone missing. Now, they used to fight with each other too, Dad said. Mabel attacked him more than once after she had that baby. No one really knows what went wrong, but something did. She was never right after that. Now, I never told him what happened to me that day. I heeded the wise advice I had received, though. I took the money, and the property and house are still sitting back in those woods, untouched. But nature will work its magic and reclaim the place eventually. Till then, though, I don't ever plan on going back there.